The expansion draft was supposed to cripple championship contenders. That's how these things work. You strip away depth, weaken rosters, force tough decisions. But something different happened on this particular day in Indianapolis. While the rest of the league held its breath, watching their players get picked apart by Portland and Toronto, the Indiana Fever made a move that nobody saw coming. They left one of their most important players completely unprotected, betting everything on a calculation that shouldn't have worked. It was bold, it was risky, and it was the kind of decision that either makes you look like a genius or haunts you forever. The dust has finally settled, the picks have been made, and what emerged from the chaos was something remarkable. The Fever didn't just survive the expansion draft, they won it. They kept their core intact, cleared crucial cap space, and positioned themselves as legitimate favorites for 2026. But the real story isn't just about who stayed or who left. It's about what this moment reveals about the Fever's front office, their understanding of the game's underlying mechanics, and why they might be playing a different sport than everyone else in the league right now. For weeks, the basketball world couldn't talk about anything else. Every social media post, every analyst take, every locker room conversation circled back to the same question. What was the Indiana Fever going to do? The expansion draft was coming, and unlike a normal draft where teams have some control over who they lose, this was different. This was chaos with rules. Portland Fire and Toronto Tempo were about to pick through the league's rosters like shoppers at a going-out-of-business sale, and the Fever's greatest treasure was sitting right in the middle of the store. Caitlin Clark wasn't going anywhere, that was obvious. She was untouchable, the franchise cornerstone, the future of women's basketball itself. But around her, there was vulnerability. There was uncertainty. And in that uncertainty lived real fear. Think about what the Fever had built. They'd finally assembled something special, something that actually felt like it could compete for a championship. Caitlin Clark was elevated beyond rookie status, proving she belonged among the league's elite. Aaliyah Boston was anchoring the paint with her characteristic dominance. Kelsey Mitchell had developed into a reliable scoring threat beside Clark. Lexi Hull was emerging as a young talent with genuine upside. And then there was Sophie Cunningham, the glue player, the enforcer, the person who made everything work smoothly in ways that didn't always show up in the box score. This was a team with chemistry, with vision, with potential. And now they had to sit and watch as it potentially got dismantled. The rules of the expansion draft made everything more complicated. The Fever could protect exactly 5 players, not 6, not 7, just 5. That meant someone was walking the plank. Someone who'd been valuable, who'd contributed, who might be valuable to a hungry expansion team looking to build something fast. The protected list would need to include the obvious 4: Clark, Boston, Mitchell, and Hull. The 5th spot was where the real anguish lived. That 5th spot was like choosing between your children, except the one you didn't choose would get drafted away. Reports suggest the front office spent sleepless nights on this decision. Should it be Sophie Cunningham, the veteran presence and locker room leader? Or should it be Mikla Timpson, the young rookie with trajectory and potential and youth on her side? Most teams in this situation would protect their established player. That's just common sense. Sophie had proven herself, had earned her spot, had shown she belonged. But the Fever's front office was looking at this differently. They weren't just thinking about next year. They were thinking about the expansion team's incentives, about what Portland and Toronto actually needed, about the actual probability that they'd make certain moves. This is where the strategic thinking started to differentiate. The expansion teams had rules too. They could only take 1 unrestricted free agent in total. 1. That was the key number that unlocked everything. Sophie was an unrestricted free agent. She could walk. She could test the market. She could sign anywhere. If Portland or Toronto used their 1 free agent slot on Sophie, they'd have to offer her a massive contract to convince her to stay, to prevent her from walking away to some other team. It would be expensive, risky, and complicated. Were they really going to gamble their cap space on a veteran when they could take younger talent that was already under contract, already locked in, already cheaper to retain? The Fever front office looked at this equation and made a decision that seemed insane on the surface. They left Sophie unprotected and protected Mikla Timpson instead. This wasn't negligence. This wasn't a mistake. This was calculated risk based on understanding what the other teams would actually do. It was betting that logic would prevail, that Portland and Toronto would take the safer path, that they'd grab established young talent like Bibby instead of rolling the dice on a massive free agent contract. It was assuming that the expansion teams were thinking the same way the Fever was thinking, strategically, rationally, understanding the full game board. The tension in the days leading up to the draft was real. Media members questioned the move. Fans worried. What if Portland just decided to be aggressive? What if Toronto wanted to disrupt Indianapolis by taking Sophie? What if the gamble backfired spectacularly? But here's the thing about championship-caliber organizations: they understand probabilities better than everyone else. They've studied the game deeper. They know how other front offices think because they think the same way. The Fever wasn't just hoping Sophie would stay. They were betting on their analysis, on their understanding of how Portland and Toronto's front offices operated, on their belief that smart teams make smart decisions. In the hours before the draft, the uncertainty hung over Indianapolis like fog. This moment would define the offseason. This moment would determine whether the Fever stayed together or got broken apart. This moment was everything. The expansion draft picks came down, and Indianapolis got its answer. 2 players would leave. Not catastrophic, not devastating, but significant. The question was who, and whether the Fever could live with those departures. First came the announcement that hit the hardest in some ways, even though it shouldn't have: Bibby, selected 11th overall by the Portland Fire. There's something about seeing a young player get their chance, and Bibby was getting hers in a big way. She was going to be part of building something from the ground up, part of Portland's inaugural roster, part of founding history. But from the Fever's perspective, losing her meant losing some of their front court depth, and more importantly, losing a player who'd already proven she could contribute at the WNBA level. Bibby had been valuable for Indiana. She brought exactly what you want from a depth player: grit, size, and an attitude that never quit. She was the kind of player who made teammates better through effort and willingness. She didn't need the ball. She didn't need the spotlight. She just showed up and competed. Coaches loved her. Teammates respected her. There's a reason she was a favorite among the coaching staff, a reason the organization had invested in her development. But she'd also dealt with a heartbreaking left knee injury that sidelined her during the season. That injury complicated everything. It meant she was recovering, rehabbing, trying to get back to form. It meant her future timeline was uncertain. For Portland, though, that didn't matter. They saw potential, they saw youth, they saw someone who could grow into their system over time. They saw someone worth developing. For the Fever, losing Bibby was a blow to their front court depth, no question. But it was also a blow they could absorb. They had Aaliyah Boston. They had options. They had flexibility. What made Bibby's departure more tolerable was what she represented. She was valuable, but she wasn't irreplaceable. She was a nice piece of a larger puzzle, not the puzzle itself. The organization made peace with it quickly because they understood the math. Bibby was going to get an opportunity in Portland, and that mattered. She deserved it. But it also meant the Fever could move forward without her. Then came the second departure, and this one was more complicated in the best possible way. Kristy Wallace, taken 22nd overall by the Toronto Tempo. Now here's where the story gets interesting, because Wallace's situation was completely different. She didn't play for the Fever in 2025. Her contract was suspended. She was essentially in limbo, a financial obligation without on-court production. She was a veteran guard with experience and skills, someone who could help a young roster understand what professional basketball demands. Toronto clearly saw her that way, a stabilizing force for their team, someone who could teach and mentor as they built their foundation. But for the Fever, losing Wallace was actually a gift wrapped up in draft pick form. This is the kind of strategic advantage that separates championship organizations from everyone else. Wallace's contract was a cap hold. It was money on the books that the organization couldn't use elsewhere. It was flexibility lost. By having her taken in the expansion draft, the Fever eliminated that cap hold. They freed up space. They cleared room on the roster. They gained flexibility that would become crucial in the days and weeks ahead when free agency opened. Wallace's departure was a departure that the Fever actually wanted to happen. It solved a problem they'd been sitting with. Think about what this means for the bigger picture. The Fever lost 2 players, yes, but one of them was a younger depth piece with injury recovery concerns, and the other was essentially a salary cap problem disguised as a roster spot. These weren't losses that crippled the organization. These weren't departures that broke the core. These were calculated exits that actually improved the organization's financial flexibility heading into free agency. This is the kind of thinking that separates good front offices from great ones. The great ones don't just hope things work out. They structure things so that different outcomes all benefit them in some way. Bibby gets her fresh start in Portland. Wallace gets her opportunity in Toronto. The Fever get cap space and roster spots to maneuver with. Everyone wins. But the real story, the one that dominated conversations immediately after the picks were announced, wasn't about who left. It was about who stayed when nobody expected them to stay. It was about Sophie Cunningham still being in an Indiana uniform. It was about the gamble that worked. The two departures were important, sure, but they were just the opening act. The main event was still to come, still rippling through the basketball world with implications that nobody fully understood yet. This is where the story becomes legendary. This is where the Fever front office showed their cards and revealed they'd been playing four-dimensional chess while everyone else was still figuring out checkers. Before the expansion draft, the assumption was that Sophie Cunningham would be protected. She was established. She was proven. She was the kind of player you keep around. She was a veteran presence in a young locker room. She made everyone else better. She was, by traditional metrics, untouchable. But the Fever made a decision that seemed absolutely reckless from the outside. They left Sophie Cunningham unprotected. The protected list came down with Caitlin Clark, Aaliyah Boston, Kelsey Mitchell, and Lexi Hull locked in. Those four were never getting touched, that was obvious. But the fifth spot? The fifth spot went to Mikla Timpson, the young rookie with upside. Reports suggest the Fever front office had studied the expansion draft mechanics obsessively. They'd looked at what teams needed, what made sense financially, what the expansion franchises would actually prioritize. And they'd come to a conclusion that seemed absolutely insane but was actually perfectly logical. Here's the thing that most people weren't thinking about. Portland and Toronto could only take one unrestricted free agent each. One, that was their limit. And Sophie Cunningham was an unrestricted free agent. If either expansion team wanted to draft her, they'd have to sign her to a massive contract, a supermax potentially, to keep her from walking away and signing with someone else. That's expensive. That's risky. That ties up cap space that a brand new franchise needs for flexibility. Now, compare that to other available options. Chloe Bibby was already under contract. Young, under contract, cheaper to retain. Lexi Hull was already under contract. Kelsey Mitchell was already under contract. What would an expansion team actually want? Younger talent that was already locked in, or a veteran free agent that would require massive spending to keep? The Fever front office had essentially read the expansion team's minds before they even knew what they were thinking. They'd understood the incentive structures so completely that they were confident Sophie would still be available after the draft. They were betting their championship window on that analysis. And not just betting it casually, putting their entire future in that prediction. If they were wrong, if Portland decided to be aggressive and signed Sophie to a supermax, the whole thing fell apart. If Toronto decided that disrupting Indianapolis was worth the cap space commitment, Sophie was gone. The organization had to have full confidence in their analysis. They had to believe in their read of the game. The gamble was born from confidence born from preparation. The Fever front office hadn't just guessed. They'd done the work. They'd studied the league. They'd understood how other franchises thought. They'd put themselves in Portland's shoes and Toronto's shoes and asked themselves what they would actually do. And they'd concluded that the smart move, the moves those franchises would make, was to take young, under-contract talent rather than roll the dice on expensive free agent signings. It was a bet on everyone making rational decisions based on sound basketball economics. And then the draft happened, and the gamble paid off. Sophie Cunningham was still a member of the Indiana Fever. The enforcer stayed, the locker room presence stayed, the player who made everyone else better was still there. The chemistry that Caitlin Clark depended on remained 100% intact. The Fever purge took the depth. Bibby and Wallace were gone, but it left the heart. The organization kept their core four and added Sophie back into the protected list through the miracle of strategic thinking. The expansion draft was supposed to weaken championship contenders, and instead, Indianapolis navigated it almost perfectly. But here's what made the gamble truly remarkable. It wasn't just about keeping Sophie. It was about what keeping Sophie revealed about the Fever's organization. This wasn't a lucky break. This wasn't fortune smiling on Indiana. This was a front office that understood the game at a level deeper than most. This was strategy executed perfectly. This was confidence in analysis. This was the kind of thinking that wins championships because it shows the organization understands not just basketball, but business, incentives, probabilities, and human nature. The rest of the league was playing the expansion draft like it was something that happened to them. The Fever were playing it like they were controlling it, steering it, predicting it. They made a high-risk decision that paid off because they'd done the homework that other organizations hadn't bothered with. They'd looked at the data. They'd studied the teams. They'd thought through the scenarios. And they'd come out the other side with their core intact, their cap space improved, and Sophie Cunningham ready for another championship run. That's not luck. That's mastery. The moment Sophie Cunningham was announced as staying with the Fever, something shifted in Indianapolis. It wasn't just that a player had been retained. It was that the identity of the team remained intact. Sophie isn't a superstar. She'll never lead you in scoring. She'll never dominate a game in the traditional sense. But she's the kind of player that championship teams absolutely need because she affects everything in ways that don't always show up in traditional statistics. She's the heart of the operation, and losing her would have meant losing something far more valuable than depth. It would have meant losing chemistry. Think about what chemistry actually means in basketball. It's not just players knowing each other's names. It's not just showing up to practice together. Real chemistry is understanding how someone moves, anticipating their next step, having an implicit trust that makes communication unnecessary. It's the feeling that comes when you know the person next to you on the court has your back in every situation. Sophie creates that feeling. She's the glue player in the most literal sense. She does the small things that make everything else work. She sets screens the right way. She makes the extra pass. She plays defense on the opposing team's best perimeter threat. She fits seamlessly into whatever system the team is running. For Caitlin Clark specifically, Sophie's presence is enormous. Clark is the franchise player, the person who demands the ball and needs to control the game. But even the greatest players need support. They need someone they trust implicitly. They need a running mate who understands them deeply. Sophie understands Caitlin. She's played alongside her. She knows how Clark thinks. She knows what Clark needs. That kind of understanding can't be replicated. You can't just bring in a new player and have them immediately understand the Clark-Sophie dynamic. That chemistry took time to build, and it's invaluable once it's there. The locker room matters too, and this is where Sophie's importance becomes even clearer. Reports suggest she's the kind of player who keeps everyone grounded, who can break tension with humor, who genuinely cares about her teammates beyond just what they do on the court. She's the person who makes the locker room function as a unit rather than a collection of individuals. When you're building a championship team, you need certain personalities in the room. You need scorers, sure. You need defenders. You need shot creators and playmakers. But you also need the human glue that keeps everyone connected to the mission. You need the person who can lighten the mood when things get heavy or steady the ship when things get chaotic. The Fever recognized this completely when they made the decision to leave her unprotected. It wasn't just a calculated risk about expansion team behavior. It was a statement about their priorities. They were saying that keeping Sophie was more important than the conventional wisdom of protecting your veteran players. They were saying that team chemistry was worth risking on. They were saying that they understood basketball at a deeper level than just asset accumulation. Sophie staying in Indianapolis wasn't just about roster management. It was about maintaining the culture they'd built. What makes this even more important is that the Fever are a young team with potential. Caitlin Clark is still developing. Aaliyah Boston is entering her prime. Lexi Hull is still rising. These players are still learning what it takes to win at the professional level. Having Sophie there as a steadying presence, as someone who's been through the battles and knows what championship-caliber teams require, is invaluable. She's not just a teammate. She's a teacher. She's a mentor. She's the kind of veteran presence that young players rely on, sometimes without even realizing how much they're benefiting from it. The enforcer stayed. That's what people started calling her, the enforcer. The player who enforces standards, who maintains the culture, who doesn't let things slide. In a league where chemistry can be fragile and team identity can shift quickly, having that presence locked in for the foreseeable future is massive. The Fever could have lost Sophie and brought in another scorer or another offensive weapon. Maybe that would have looked better on paper. Maybe that would have generated more highlights. But the intangible value of keeping Sophie intact, of maintaining the chemistry that's been built, is something that championship teams understand at a fundamental level. So when the expansion draft ended and Sophie was still there in an Indiana uniform, it wasn't just a roster decision being made. It was a statement about what the Fever organization values. It was a commitment to building something the right way, with the right people, at the right pace. It was understanding that the most important things in sports aren't always the most visible things. The numbers matter, sure, but sometimes the numbers don't tell the full story. Sometimes the most important thing is simply having the right person in the room, the right presence on the court, the right heartbeat keeping the team's identity alive. And for the Indiana Fever, that heartbeat belonged to Sophie Cunningham. In the midst of all this expansion draft chaos, with uncertainty swirling around Indianapolis and analysts debating what the Fever should do, Caitlin Clark did something that most players don't do. She spoke up. She didn't stay silent and let the front office handle things behind closed doors. She went public about what she wanted, what she needed, and what the team's priorities should be. Just days before the expansion draft, in an interview, she made her position crystal clear. The Fever's first priority had to be re-signing Kelsey Mitchell. Not a top priority, the first priority, the essential piece that couldn't be negotiated away. She's kind of my running mate in the backcourt. She makes it really easy for me. That's what Clark said. Think about what that statement reveals. Caitlin Clark, the franchise centerpiece, the person everyone defers to, was publicly saying that Kelsey Mitchell was critical to her success. Mitchell wasn't just another guard. She wasn't just another scoring option. She was the running mate, the person Clark trusted to handle the backcourt responsibilities, the player who made the entire system work more smoothly. For a player of Clark's caliber to make that kind of public declaration is significant. It shows appreciation for a teammate, sure, but it also shows strategy. It shows that Clark understands team basketball at a sophisticated level. Kelsey Mitchell had proven herself in the 2025 season. She developed into a reliable second scoring option. She'd shown she could handle the pressure of playing alongside the Rookie of the Year. She'd found her role and executed it well. But beyond the statistics, Mitchell was something else. She was safe. She was the kind of player who wouldn't demand the ball constantly, who would defer to Clark when necessary, who would step up when opportunities presented themselves. She was the ideal complementary guard next to a generational talent. Clark recognized this and said it publicly. She put her weight behind the decision to bring Mitchell back. And then the expansion draft happened, and by some combination of strategy and good fortune, the Fever kept not just Kelsey Mitchell, but also Sophie Cunningham and Lexi Hull. The backcourt of the century stayed intact. That wasn't an accident. That was the front office executing a plan while the draft was happening. By protecting Mitchell and Hull while leaving Sophie unprotected, they ensured that even if something unexpected happened, the core of their young talent was safe. And then Sophie staying through the free agent exemption meant they got to keep all three. The backcourt wasn't just intact, it was whole. What happened in the wider league during the draft adds context to how significant Clark's vision was becoming. Marina Mabrey, the player often discussed as Clark's rival, was snatched up by Toronto. This matters because it removes a scoring threat from the league's landscape and adds it to an expansion team. On the surface, that's actually good news for the Fever. They're not directly losing anything, but a potential threat is being diluted into an expansion franchise. But it also shows how the draft was reshaping the league's competitive balance. Teams were getting stronger in some ways, weaker in others. The landscape was shifting. Yet Caitlin Clark came out after the dust settled and made a statement that seemed almost too bold. I think we're going to be the favorite to win it all. She didn't hedge. She didn't qualify it with if everything breaks right, or hopefully, or we have a chance. She stated it as fact. We're going to be the favorite. Not we could be, not we might be, but we're going to be. That's incredible confidence. That's the kind of confidence that either looks genius or looks foolish in retrospect. But for a player of Clark's stature, with the roster the Fever have assembled, maybe that confidence is actually justified. Think about what had just happened. The expansion draft, which was explicitly designed to weaken championship contenders, had left the Fever stronger in relative terms. They'd lost 2 rotational players, sure, but they kept their core intact. They gained cap flexibility. They showed strategic sophistication that nobody else in the league had demonstrated. Caitlin Clark was looking at this and understanding what it meant. The Fever hadn't been weakened by the expansion draft. They'd been strengthened by it. They'd kept their team together while other organizations were dealing with real losses. They'd proven that their front office understood the game at a higher level. And now they were heading into the draft and free agency with more resources than they had before. Clark's confidence wasn't arrogance. It was clarity. She'd been elevated beyond rookie status into the realm of franchise cornerstones. She was making her own decisions about team direction. She was voicing her priorities publicly. She was understanding the chess game that was being played at the management level, and she was concluding that the pieces on the board were positioned correctly for a championship run. The backcourt was staying together, Clark, Mitchell, and Hull in their respective roles. Sophie was keeping the chemistry intact. Aaliyah Boston was anchoring the paint. Everything was aligning. For the first time, it seemed like the Fever weren't just hoping to compete. They were positioning themselves to dominate. The expansion draft wasn't just about what happened in Indianapolis. It was about what happened everywhere and how the Fever's sophisticated approach stood out against the backdrop of the entire league's reshuffling. Across the WNBA, teams were experiencing different levels of disruption. Some were losing key players. Some were gaining interesting pieces. Some were getting weaker. And some, like Indiana, were actually getting stronger in meaningful ways. But the real story of the bigger picture was how the expansion draft revealed fundamental truths about team building and front office competence. Marina Mabrey going to Toronto was significant for more reasons than just the rivalry angle with Caitlin Clark. Mabrey is a talented player, a potential all-star, someone who could develop into a legitimate scoring threat. Her departure from whatever team she was with meant that team lost something valuable. But her arrival in Toronto meant an expansion franchise got a boost. That's good for Toronto's timeline. That's excellent for their chances of being competitive relatively quickly. But it also means one of the league's existing franchises got weakened by losing her. The ripple effects of the expansion draft were everywhere. Other franchises dealt with different disruptions. Some lost depth players, some lost veterans, some lost young talent with potential. The expansion draft was designed to distribute the pain evenly enough that nobody got completely devastated, but it did force every organization to make hard choices. Most teams did what you'd expect. They protected their obvious stars and let everything else fall where it may. They hoped for the best and crossed their fingers that the expansion teams would make choices they could live with. That's the conventional approach, and it's how most of the league operated. But Indianapolis was different. They looked at the same rules and constraints and found a way to use the system rather than just react to it. They understood that probabilities weren't guarantees, and they made a decision based on understanding what the expansion teams would likely do. They protected a young player with potential rather than a proven veteran. They gambled on their read of the situation, and they were rewarded for it. Sophie Cunningham stayed. The core stayed intact. The chemistry stayed intact. The leadership stayed intact. Now think about what happens as the offseason progresses. The Fever still have their draft picks available on April 13th. They're still going into free agency with cap flexibility that was gained by losing Wallace. They're still positioned as one of the teams with the most room to maneuver. Other franchises were weaker coming out of the expansion draft because they lost players they wanted to keep. The Fever were stronger because they lost players they'd already decided were expendable while keeping the pieces that actually mattered. That's the difference between reactive front offices and proactive front offices. That's the difference between hoping things work out and engineering them to work out. The league is getting deeper and more dangerous in certain ways. The expansion franchises are assembling rosters that will improve over time. But from the Fever's perspective, that doesn't matter as much as maintaining their own trajectory. They're not trying to prevent the rest of the league from getting better. They're trying to maximize their own competitive window while it's open. They have a generational talent in Caitlin Clark at the beginning of her career. They have a young core that's still developing. They have a narrow window to strike while the pieces are still young, still hungry, still undervalued by the rest of the league. Every team in the WNBA eventually has to rebuild. Every franchise goes through cycles, but the Fever are in a special moment right now where their cycle is ascending. They're getting better, not weaker. Their best players are entering their primes while still being on rookie or cheap contracts. They have cap space. They have draft picks. They have chemistry. They have leadership from their franchise player who publicly states her priorities and backs them up with on-court performance. The bigger picture shows a league in transition, with new franchises arriving and old power structures being challenged. But it also shows one franchise, Indianapolis, positioned better than almost anyone else to capitalize on the moment. The April 13th draft will give the Fever another opportunity to add. Free agency will provide more options. The May 9th start to the season will be the ultimate reset button, the moment where all the planning and strategizing and roster building becomes actual basketball. But right now, looking at the bigger picture, the Fever look like they're the team that understood the expansion draft better than anyone else. They didn't lose, they managed. They didn't hope, they engineered. They didn't cross their fingers, they calculated. And as the rest of the league figures out what just happened, Indianapolis is already 3 moves ahead, already planning their next steps, already positioning themselves for the championship push that seemed far away just weeks ago. What the Indiana Fever front office executed over the course of the expansion draft period wasn't just good management. It was a clinic in how to navigate complexity while maintaining clarity. Most organizations operate with decent competence. They make reasonable decisions. They hire people who understand basketball. They try to build rosters that make sense. But there's a difference between competent and exceptional, and the Fever stepped into exceptional territory during this process. The salary cap situation is where this becomes most obvious. Kristy Wallace had a cap hold, money allocated to her on the books even though she wasn't playing. For an organization trying to maintain flexibility and create room to operate, that cap hold was a problem. It was money that couldn't be used elsewhere. It was cap space that was dead weight. A conventional front office would have tried to trade Wallace or perhaps released her at a certain point to clear the cap space. But the Fever looked at the expansion draft and saw an opportunity. They saw a way to get Wallace on another team's roster while clearing their own cap space in the process. That's elegant. That's the kind of thinking that separates great front offices from good ones. By losing Wallace to the expansion draft, the Fever didn't just get rid of a contract. They positioned themselves for maximum flexibility heading into free agency. Free agency is when organizations spend the most money and make the biggest commitments. It's when the salary cap becomes most critical. Having extra flexibility in free agency is worth more than having it during the regular season. The Fever understood this completely. They structured their expansion draft protection list knowing that losing Wallace would actually improve their position. That's forward thinking. That's multiple moves ahead of the present moment. But it's not just about Wallace. It's about the entire equation. The Fever lost Bibby and Wallace, 2 rotational players, 2 people who had been part of the organization, 2 roster spots that would need to be filled. But here's the crucial part. They kept everyone who mattered most. The 4-star players stayed. Sophie stayed. The draft picks were preserved. The organization maintained maximum flexibility to add during the draft and free agency. This means they could potentially add more talent after losing players. It means the disruption of losing 2 people could actually result in a net gain of talent quality if the front office executes well in the coming weeks. This is the kind of strategic depth that championship organizations develop. They understand not just who should be on the roster, but how roster construction interacts with salary cap management, draft strategy, and free agency timing. They understand that sometimes losing a player is better than keeping them if it creates space for something better. They understand the full game board, not just the immediate decision in front of them. The Fever demonstrated all of this understanding during the expansion draft period. The draft on April 13th is the next major event. The Fever have picks available. They need to replace the depth that Bibby and Wallace represented. But they're also in a position to target players who specifically fit their system and their needs. They have cap space to potentially add players beyond the draft. They have flexibility that other organizations don't have because they made smarter decisions earlier. Some teams will be constrained by bad cap situations or by losing key players they couldn't afford to lose. The Fever won't have those problems. They'll have options. Then there's what happens in May when the season starts. The Fever will take the court with essentially the same core they had before the expansion draft, minus 2 rotational players. But those 2 rotational players will have been replaced through smart draft and free agency work. The organization will have maintained continuity while improving depth. That's the holy grail of roster management, staying the same in the ways that matter while getting better in the ways that don't yet matter as much. You keep your stars together. You keep your chemistry intact. You keep your identity intact, but you upgrade the supporting cast. This is what separates legendary front offices from good ones. Legendary front offices understand that every decision intersects with every other decision. They understand that free agency flexibility is worth something. They understand that chemistry is worth something. They understand that draft capital is worth something. They understand that player relationships are worth something. They weight all these factors and make decisions that maximize the total value created. The Fever did exactly that during the expansion draft period. Look at the decisions they made. Protect Clark, Boston, Mitchell, and Hull because they're the core. Protect Timpson over Sophie because Sophie is a free agent and the expansion teams won't want to pay her massive money. Lose Wallace to clear cap space. Lose Bibby because she was the most expendable rotation player. The logic flows from one decision to the next. Everything is connected. Everything makes sense when you understand what the organization is trying to accomplish. And what are they trying to accomplish? A championship. Not next year, not someday, but with the current window that's open. They're trying to keep the core together while they're young. They're trying to maintain flexibility to add pieces around that core. They're trying to keep the culture intact. They're trying to position themselves to strike in 2026. Everything the front office did during the expansion draft period served that goal. That's mastery. That's the kind of execution that makes other organizations jealous and makes competing against Indianapolis incredibly difficult. The Fever front office just showed the entire league what championship-caliber organizational thinking looks like. This wasn't just a roster decision. This wasn't just one day of draft picks and announcements. This was a moment that will be remembered years from now, a moment that defined a season before it was even played, a moment that revealed what the Indiana Fever organization is capable of when everything aligns. In May, when the 2026 WNBA season tips off, that season will have been decided in many ways during this expansion draft period. The competitive landscape was set. The advantages were distributed. The Fever's position in the championship race was established. Caitlin Clark comes off a FIBA MVP award. That's not just a regular accomplishment. That's international recognition of excellence. That's validation that she belongs not just in the WNBA, but among the greatest players in the world at her position. She's entering her second WNBA season as one of the most valuable players in the league, with experience now, with understanding of what professional basketball demands, with the confidence that comes from succeeding at the highest levels. She's not a rookie anymore. She's a force. And she's doing it while surrounded by an organization that understands how to position itself for success. Sophie Cunningham is staying home. That phrase should be emphasized. Home. That's what Indianapolis represents to Sophie now. That's where she has roots, where she has chemistry, where she belongs. She's not going somewhere new. She's not learning a new system. She's staying in place. That stability, that continuity, that sense of home, it matters more than people realize. In professional sports, where change is constant and nothing is guaranteed, having something stable, something familiar, something you've already built chemistry with is invaluable. Sophie is staying home, and that means the Fever's heart is staying home. The Fever are the undisputed favorites to win the 2026 WNBA title. That's not speculation or hope. That's how the league views them. After navigating the expansion draft without losing any core players while maintaining flexibility, after keeping their chemistry intact, after demonstrating superior organizational thinking, Indianapolis is positioned as the team to beat. Vegas will probably have them as favorites. Media analysis will point to them. Opponents will be gunning for them. That's the burden of being the favorite, but it's also the privilege. It means the league recognizes you as the team most likely to win it all. This moment is significant because of what it reveals about organizational direction. The Fever aren't hoping to compete in 2026. They're positioned to dominate. They're not trying to be competitive. They're trying to win it all. Those are different things. A competitive team might win some games and make the playoffs. A dominant team sets expectations that are higher. The Fever, coming out of the expansion draft, look like a team that could be dominant. They have the talent. They have the depth. They have the leadership. They have the organizational clarity. They have the championship window. All the pieces are aligned. What happened on draft day was that the front office proved they could play chess while everyone else was still playing checkers. That's not an exaggeration. The complexity of understanding expansion draft mechanics, predicting how other teams would behave, protecting the right players, leaving the right players exposed, understanding salary cap implications, and positioning for free agency and the draft that requires a level of thinking that most organizations don't achieve. Most organizations make good decisions. This organization made brilliant decisions. They understood systems and incentives and probabilities in ways that created competitive advantage. This advantage will compound over time. When the draft happens and the Fever add new talent, that talent will be added to an organization that has proven it knows how to build rosters. When free agency happens and the Fever sign new players, those players will be joining an organization that understands how to create chemistry and maintain culture. When the season starts and the team takes the court, they'll do it with confidence born from knowing that their front office is operating at the highest levels. That confidence is contagious. That's the kind of thing that affects locker room dynamics and player development and competitive mentality. The expansion draft was supposed to cripple championship contenders. It was designed to weaken the top teams and give expansion franchises a chance to compete. It was supposed to be disruptive and painful. But for the Indiana Fever, it became an opportunity. It became a moment to display competence. It became a moment to create competitive advantage. It became a moment that, when this team wins their first championship in franchise history, people will point back to and understand was pivotal. This moment right here, with Sophie Cunningham staying home and the core intact and the front office showing their mastery, was when the Fever sealed their fate. Not their fate to lose, but their fate to win. This is the legacy of the expansion draft. Not the losses that happened, but the gains. Not the disruption, but the clarity. Not the chaos, but the strategy. The Indiana Fever looked at one of the most unpredictable moments in their recent history and turned it into an advantage. They protected what mattered. They sacrificed what didn't. They positioned themselves for the future. And they did it all while keeping the heart of the organization intact. Sophie Cunningham, the enforcer, the glue, the player who makes everyone else better. She stays. The team stays. The vision stays. The championship window is open, and the Fever are walking through it with their eyes wide open, their organization aligned, and their confidence at an all-time high. The expansion draft is over. The picks have been made. The rosters have been set. 2 players left Indianapolis in Bibby and Kristy Wallace, but the Fever gained something far more valuable: clarity about their future and confidence in their organizational direction. Sophie Cunningham stayed home. The core 4 remained together. The chemistry stayed intact. The vision stayed focused. What the Indiana Fever demonstrated during this period wasn't luck or accident. It was the result of sophisticated thinking, deep preparation, and organizational clarity about what actually matters in building a championship team. As we move toward April's draft and May's season start, remember this moment. Remember that the Fever didn't just survive the expansion draft. They used it to strengthen their position. Remember that their front office understood incentives better than everyone else. Remember that they made decisions based on probabilities and analysis rather than hope and convention. This foundation, laid during the expansion draft, will support their championship ambitions all season long. The favorite tag is theirs. The narrative is written. Now it's time to see if they can execute what they've so carefully positioned themselves for. The Fever are coming, and they're coming for it all.